To begin with, let me acknowledge the peoples of Treaty 6 and the Métis Nation as we are visitors on their traditional territory. And let me really thank you, Dr. Batiste. And I thank all of those who are responsible for giving me this opportunity to engage with you in open discussion and to learn from those who will be speaking throughout the conference. I'm looking very much forward to this afternoon, simply for the reason that when it comes to the how of indigenizing education, I will be the first to admit that I have a lot more questions than I do answers. The fact is, we're here today because the history of the indigenous populations of the world is a book most people have never read. And this is certainly true of Canada. And unfortunately, when we do read the book of the First Nations, the Métis Nation and the Inuit, it begins with the European explorers, who, after they figured out this wasn't India or China, believed that they had discovered a new continent where no one of any consequence lived. And as a result, believing that native culture had no value, the settlers who followed made no attempt to understand it because they assumed that its people had nothing to say. Thus began the tradition which too many of us are the heirs of, the tradition of dismissing indigenous knowledge out of hand, in order to impose the European blinkered view of everything they saw, everything they touched, and everything they heard. In short, from the very beginning, those of you who went to schools in my time understand this story so very much. The newcomer's message to North America's first peoples was the mantra that was used by colonial powers the world over. I have spent a lot of time in Africa, and I can tell you the message of colonization in Africa, the colonization in Indonesia, places like that where I've also spent a lot of time, was exactly the one that was here. We told them, we told ourselves that all that we believed was good and all that they believed, their history, their traditions, was irrelevant. And over time, because we had imported disease, because we had bigger guns, and also, and this is very important, because we had a different view of the land, the prejudices of the settlers became even more entrenched. Indeed, this bias continues until today, reaching even unto those bastions of so-called objective thought, our universities. Marie Batiste points out in her remarkable book, Decolonizing Education, where she writes, and I'd like to quote from it, "Indigenous knowledge needs to be interpreted as the indigenous people themselves understand it. The problem being, that Marie goes on to say, is that every university has been structured to see the world through the lens of Eurocentric vision, which opposes indigenous perspectives." I've got to tell you, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, when she first said that and I sat down and talked to her, I had a terrible time understanding it. But before I began to understand that, in fact, I had obviously been so brought up in the Eurocentric vision that how could I think outside of that? And I've got to say that I still have difficulties with this, and I would hope during this afternoon or the opportunity to exchange with you that I can maybe get a little closer to the understanding. The question is, so what do we do about this? Well, thankfully, having diagnosed the problem, Dr. Batiste then gave us a prescription. And again, I will quote, "Post-colonialism," she writes, "is not about rejecting all theory or research or Western knowledge. It is about creating a new space where the indigenous people's knowledge, identity, and future is calculated into the global and contemporary equation." End of quote. The question before us today, as I understand Dr. Williamson, the purpose of this conference, is to really answer, how do we do that? How do we create that new space that will make a place for indigenous knowledge, identity, and future? I have a couple of suggestions. I make them really quite reluctantly, recognizing just how little knowledge and how much background I have. But as I see it, my first suggestion would recognize who our allies are. And the fact is, there is a branch of university learning that should be an ally. It is the humanities. Philosophy, I majored in, literature, history, art, for instance. Those who share with indigenous thought a deep historic desire to make sense of the world around us. Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Are these not the questions that human beings have asked themselves since time immemorial? And should we only reserve these questions for the evolution of certain cultures, traditions, or beliefs? I think not. If it is, as I believe, that it is knowledge, for knowledge's sake, that has led to humanity's greatest triumphs, then the question becomes quite straightforward. It is, how can we move ahead if Canadian scholars are confined to a conventional wisdom, bound by Western limits, and sustained by the least curious among us? And the answer is we can't. And thus, one of the major goals of a university must be to open its doors to curiosity and critical thinking. Open those doors to all of those who would advance our understanding of humanity's path. Whether it is acknowledged by the majority or not, the underpinnings of Canadian society are not derived solely from European origins. And if our thinking continues to ignore the perspective of a people who were here long before the Europeanization of the continent took place, then we will be turning our backs on the very traditions of learning that the humanities seek to uphold. The fact is, our civilization is built on one that existed long before most of us got here. And to deny the consequences of that coming together is to misunderstand our own origins. And it is subvert the very questions that have led to the huge advances in human knowledge thus far. When I think back in my own time in university, as I mentioned, I majored in philosophy. And when I think of just how narrow that construct was when I went through. But I tell you something, and this is why I think that those of you who are Indigenous in this room have got to understand the difficulty some of the rest of us have. We felt that we were open to the world. We felt that all of the great thinking in the world was the world thinking that was provided us. It never crossed our minds, and all of a sudden to have that perspective that the world is much larger in terms of the evolution of its thought than we thought, takes a little bit of thinking. It also takes a little bit of help. It takes a little bit of debate. And that's why I really want to congratulate you. I want to congratulate the elders, Marie, and all of you on having this conference. I think it is really very important. It's important to you, but I got to tell you, I think it's pretty important to my children and my grandchildren as well. Now, some, of course, will say that it's water. I'm from Quebec. Now, some, of course, will say to you that Indigenous stories are allegorical. They're hardly the material upon which a modern thinker can build. Well, to that I can only say, read Genesis in the Old Testament and then tell me that we can't build a system of belief on allegory. Or listen again to the creation story of the Blackfoot Confederacy, which begins with rock dust circulating through space and then all of a sudden pouring into the earth. And from there came the Blackfoot. Allegorical, perhaps. But can somebody tell me how thousands of nights ago, when that story was first told around a campfire, a Blackfoot elder had figured out the Big Bang Theory, which today's scientists described as the beginning of what has led to all of us? Now, at this point, somebody's going to say that I'm being naive and seeking greater emphasis on Indigenous thought in our universities. Perhaps, but I found over the last number of years, and especially since this new world has opened up to me, that our universities have shown a far greater willingness to advance the cause. But if there are still those who seek to question whether Indigenous thought should fill increasing space in our great institutions of learning, I would simply point out the demographic reality that Indigenous Canadians are the youngest segment of our society. And my generation is aging this country. And as that young cohort of Indigenous students, increasingly aware of their culture and their history, enter university, then I would tell you that it is Eurocentric thought that will be the casualty if humanity's great questions are not considered in a far greater and a great wider mosaic than at the present time. And indeed, it is this reference to the next generation of students that raises the second issue I would like to speak to in light of Dr. Batiste's quest, and indeed in like of the quest that has brought all of you here today. For the battle will not be won on university campuses alone. It will only be won if real change takes place in the nation's primary and secondary schools as well. For it is they who house the university students of tomorrow. And in this context, the question is, how long can we ignore the need for Indigenous thought in our off-reserve schools, in our public schools, where too often Aboriginal students find themselves in classrooms which unconsciously deny their presence by way of inadequate curriculum and teacher training? And in the same vein, how long can we ignore the gross underfunding by the federal government of on-reserve schools, which not only deprives First Nation students of the breadth of education that is provided other students in the public schools, but it deprives educators of the flexibility to create curriculum that takes into account Indigenous learning? Now, dealing with this unacceptable discrimination in funding was one of the successes of the Kelowna Accord in 2006, which is, the Kelowna Accord was a consensus. It was a consensus that took place between the Inuit, First Nations, and the Métis leaders, who sat down at the table with the Prime Minister and the Premiers, and answered the question we put to them, which is, what are the issues you want to talk about that we have to deal with in education, and how do you want to deal with it? That consensus was arrived at over 15 months of negotiation by the country's Aboriginal leaders, the Premiers, the Prime Minister, from, I must say, all three political parties who were in office provincially. That the current government acts, I don't want to be partisan here, but I really have to deal with the truth. That the current government acts the accord upon taking office and then ignored its consequences is unforgivable. As confirmed by the United Nations rapporteur on Indigenous rights, who found that for much of the last 10 years, there has been almost no improvement, visible improvement, in our elementary schools and our secondary schools in terms of Aboriginal teaching, Aboriginal understanding. And it's in this context that we have to wonder about the government's recent bill, C-33, which not only does not provide sufficient funding to provide the need, but incredibly delays any increase for 2 years. But the second point is the one that really gets to me the most. Furthermore, seemingly oblivious to the importance of community involvement in a child's schooling. Right across this country, we understand how important local involvement in a child's schooling is. Right across this country, we understand just how important it is that parents have the ability to participate in their children's education. And for heaven's sakes, in terms of Indigenous Canadians, after 150 years of residential schools, with the terrible consequences of those residential schools and the problems that we're having getting parents to be involved, to basically say that they should not be involved in their children's schooling because it is going to be done by a bunch of bureaucrats in Ottawa who come from no Department of Education, who have no education skills, doesn't make any sense at all. But I don't care strongly about that. Hi, Sean. And then finally, compounding its perversity, when the First Nations stood their ground and opposed the legislation, the government rejected any pretense of consultation, the minister stating unequivocally that it was the government's plan or no plan, confirming that in Cabinet's view, the future of Indigenous students should simply be pawned off to the lowest bidder. What is perhaps the most inconceivable is that the government would betray its fiduciary responsibility in this way, when in fact it has before it, or more likely on a dusty shelf in a shuttered library somewhere, the recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples published in 1996, which says, and I quote again, "We believe that Aboriginal parents and Aboriginal communities must have the opportunity to implement their vision of education." And then the most important sentence, in my opinion, in the whole report, would have said, Aboriginal children are entitled to learn and achieve in an environment that supports their development as whole individuals. It is this statement, in my opinion, that must penetrate the conscience of the nation. And for that to occur, there are two things that must happen. The first is that Indigenous history must be taught in our schools. Otherwise, Canadians who are a fair people will be forced, as they are now, to rely on one-dimensional stereotypes with no historical dimension. This was especially evident during the recent Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where the common refrain of Canadians was that they had never heard of the residential schools and its cultural genocide prior to the survivors telling the stories. And I'll just tell you something. I was a witness at the TRC in Montreal, and I stood up. I talked about what had happened, and then I said, what I don't understand, and there were about 20 members of Parliament in the room. And so I asked them, I said, how many of the members of Parliament, men and women who were probably about my age, some 10 years younger, how many of you heard of the residential schools before you became members of Parliament? Not one raised their hand. And I went down and talked to them. Not one raised their hands. The fact is that if you go out on the street today, even after the TNRC, and ask the average Canadian, what do you know about the residential schools? And they will be blank, because nobody talked to them about it in history. It was never given to them at a time when they were learning. The second essential element required to bring Canadians into the debate is that the media has to enter the fray, and it has to do so knowledgeably. The reason that Indigenous concerns do not make the news is because they're not considered news. Circumstances that would dominate the national headlines if they occurred in non-Indigenous communities, such as 60% dropout rates, schools built on toxic dumps, the failure to teach language skills, are not considered newsworthy. And the issue doesn't end there. And this is because what little reporting there is on Indigenous issues is most often given without sufficient context. Even when the stories are sympathetic, that's all they reflect usually, sympathy. But there is no analysis, there is no context, there is no background. And the odds are pretty great. It's because the person writing the story has no context, no background, no understanding. But the issue is that sympathy without analysis simply builds on the false stereotypes of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. And it does nothing to inform the public about the biases that created those false stereotypes in the first place. It's against these odds that one then joins the battle to provide the Indigenous worldview its place in the national spectrum. For instance, a master's thesis by Chloe Ferguson in my office found that when expert opinion is used in the reporting of Indigenous issues, it is rarely Aboriginal expertise that is called upon or that is decisive. This clearly reinforces the false notion that there are few Indigenous professionals who are capable of providing first-hand experience and needed insight, leaving the impression, to be truthful, that those who haven't lived the issue are more knowledgeable than those who have. The same thesis pointed out that when Indigenous leaders raise issues, the media too often challenges their point of view, but the government's point of view is taken as fact. For example, not long ago, when the members of the AFN met to discuss how to approach Ottawa on the widely recognized education funding gap, the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs announced that his department had completed an extensive study which concluded that there was no such gap. I was the Minister of Finance. Let me tell you, I know there's a gap, okay? And it's there in black and white. They have it on the books, and they know what the numbers are, and they haven't been prepared to release them. The minister did this deliberately on the same day as the AFN's meeting took place. And they did it for one reason, and that was in order to create a wedge between the participants. And it worked. Because the chiefs differed tactically as how to deal with the government. And so, not surprisingly, this resulted in a skewed media focus. The result being that the substance of the chiefs' meeting was totally lost. And all Canadians heard was more of the same about Indigenous leaders who can't get along. And then to add insult to injury, a couple of months later, when the government backpedaled and admitted that there was a funding gap, the fact that the government had misled the public was barely raised in the mainstream media, which had earlier allowed themselves to be used as a pawn of government spin. In short, and now I speak to not only to the Indigenous leaders, but also to Indigenous educators. Because to be quite honest, if I may be allowed a slight criticism, the leaders speak. I don't hear much from the educators. And I think that it's important that the educators speak out, The educators are the ones with the knowledge. There are phenomenal educators in this country, Aboriginal educators. Shawneen, I see you sitting there. Marie, and all of the rest of you. And yet, when the question comes down to control of Aboriginal education, all of these Aboriginal educators of these huge skills are going to turn this over to a bunch of bureaucrats in Ottawa where there is no Department of Education and there is no skills. It doesn't make any sense. And so, in an arena where wedge politics, in fact, replaces sound policy, winning the media battle becomes crucial if fair and comprehensive reporting to Canadians is to be the order of the day. And unfortunately, we are not winning that battle. Now, is the responsibility here only the media's? No, it's not. As I've just said, in my opinion, Indigenous leaders and educators have to explain to Canadians to a far greater extent than they have so far what's at play. And when they do, the results are dramatic. Let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. When the federal government first presented its education plan, it contained no new funding. And the minister gave the AFN short shrift. Subsequently, however, the AFN's position was explained to the Association of Deans of Canada's Universities, who, after learning the facts, then came out publicly against the government's plan. Shortly thereafter, the government announced that there would be new funding. Inadequate, but still new funding. Coincidence? I don't think so. Second example took place 2 months ago. In speaking to the Canadian Public School Boards Association about Indigenous education, I found huge support for the Indigenous position from the Canadian school boards, not because of anything I said, but because the trustees, the school trustees, understood the issues. This is the second time I've spoken to the school boards, and their support can be invaluable, not only in the larger fairness battle, but in terms of specific programs. For instance, we have the group that I'm involved with has an education initiative that has a business program for Indigenous students in grades 11 and 12 on and off reserve. In fact, some of the key people are in this room today. This is one of the only programs in the world which uses workbooks and textbooks specifically designed for Indigenous students. Let me just take a minute on that. What happened was we were teaching the course for 3 years. It's a business course. Essentially, it's based on a lot of involvement, but mostly it was curriculum curricula. After 3 years, in about 4 schools, the students came to us and they said, for God's sake, are there no Indigenous business people? Are there no Indigenous business people who can basically be the examples for us? So we took 2 of our teachers, and they went off and they took a year off, and along with Nelson Publishing, who I think there's a representative of Nelson here today, actually, who did a tremendous job for us. What they did was to essentially write the first workbooks that have ever been done in terms of Indigenous education on business. And our courses have just taken off like this. In fact, 2 years ago, the Saskatchewan School Board Association approached us about taking the program on. And as of this month, we're in 44 schools, and as of this month, it will be implemented in 17 high schools in the province of Saskatchewan. Now, if that isn't a testament to a school board's preparedness to advance the cause, then I don't know what is. There is phenomenal help out there, if only the educators and the leaders are prepared to speak to the people, debate with the people, and ask for it. And this brings me to my final point. You'd be glad to know. Two of the 3 questions that have to be answered for Canadians is, why should there be free funding? And why should Aboriginal schools come under Aboriginal control? Both questions relate to elementary and secondary schooling, not to the universities. And the answers, of course, should be self-evident to anybody who understands equality rights or with the discussions which have brought us here today. The third question, however, is a bit more difficult. Primarily, to be frank, it is not yet part of the wider public debate. And that question is, how do you provide, the questions you're dealing with here today, how do you provide the Indigenous worldview with the recognition it deserves in our universities? It's the answer to that question which Marie Baptiste and so many of you are now taking into the cloistered halls of our universities. And if I may say so, the timing for this battle could not be better. For instance, clearly, in the fight for environmental sustainability, the Western model doesn't stand a chance. Despite this, however, The powerful tie that Indigenous Canadians have to the land is too often portrayed as a refusal to get on with the 21st century. This is the line the governments use when the First Nations insist on proper environmental analysis of new projects. Well, let me tell you, if my water had been contaminated by mercury due to industrial runoff for the last 100 years, I certainly wouldn't regard the call for environmental analysis as a refusal to get on with the 21st century. Quite the opposite. Nor is the environment the only arena where the debate will take place on favorable ground. For example, of all of the economic systems that exist, I believe it is the free market which provides by far the greatest opportunity. However, I also believe the fair market will not survive if we fail to deal with the increasing inequality that accompanies it. Now, I'm not alone in believing that inequality is an issue that can no longer be ignored. Alan Greenspan, just the other day, who's not known as a bleeding heart liberal, also expressed similar views, as have a number of prominent economists. So what has this got to do with the Indigenous worldview? Well, some of you have probably read Wade Davis, the anthropologist Wade Davis. He tells a story about a South American tribal group called the Panan, who, when visiting Canada, were struck by the homelessness they saw because they could not comprehend how in a country as rich as Canada could we have homeless people in our streets. And there are those who will preach that homelessness is the inevitable, if maybe unfortunate, result of a successful economy. In other words, if you're going to have a successful economy, you're going to have inequality, you're going to have to have homeless people on our streets. Well, the Panan disagree with that. The Panan believe that the poor man shames us all. And the Panan are right. And the sooner we realize this, the sooner we will face up to the economic stagnation that is now burdening today's post-recession democracies. Let me just take 30 seconds on this. Understand, we are probably, in terms of slow growth, in the most difficult situation we have been, certainly since 2008, but certainly probably since the 1930s depression. If we don't find a way to get economic growth and people getting jobs and university graduates going out and not having to take unpaid internships, this economy is not going to survive. You're not going to succeed in that kind of a world unless you're prepared to invest in people. I tell you something, I'm now going way off topic, forgive me, but I've got the stage and you can't do anything about it. But you know, the fact of the matter is, I understand the importance of deficits. I spent my whole time as finance minister worried about being in a financial crisis. But for God's sake, eliminating the deficit is not a national goal. Creating jobs, giving people an opportunity in their lives, those are the kinds of goals. And I'll tell you something, if you invest in people, you'll eliminate your deficit a heck of a lot faster than you will by taking away the tools that they need to get there. Can Indigenous thought hold its own? Of course it can. The Western scientific approach compartmentalizes knowledge, and it does so in order to advance knowledge, and it has been tremendously successful in doing so. And you should never deny that. But this is not the approach that flows from the holistic nature of Indigenous, which is based on relationships, which is what this conference is all about. The holistic thought, however, given the fact that most people have been trained the way I have, is one of the reasons that Aboriginal thinkers have some trouble making themselves heard. But on the other hand, you know, in terms of people having a difficulty to make themselves heard, I'm not sure that quantum physicists wouldn't have a similar problem as would an Aboriginal thinker with this link, with the link and the relationships. If a physicist were to walk into a contemporary lecture hall where knowledge is broken into silos that debate cannot breach, then the quantum physicist would have trouble. Why? I'll tell you. Because quantum physics is based on the links. Quantum physics is the foundation stone for today's scientific endeavor. Yet, as with Indigenous thought, its message is not one of locked boxes, but its message is really the links between all of nature. So in fact, quantum physics call quantum the language of Mother Nature. Now, that sounds familiar. And I tell you, as a result of this, I called the Perimeter Institute, which is the head office of one of the great centers for quantum physics. I've had a lot of trouble with quantum physics because I don't speak in algebraic equations. And we discussed this. And there is no doubt that the links between, in fact, the molecular beliefs of quantum physicists and the holistic thought of the great Indigenous thinkers is very much the same. And it should be talked about and it should be related. So what's my point? It's simply that while Indigenous traditions differ from much of their Western counterparts, this is not to say that in the search for truth we cannot learn from each. And the time to drive that home is now. And why? And I will now close. The answer will be found in an insight of the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, who suggested that it is non-recognition, the fact of simply not being there in the minds of the majority, of being invisible, is one of the major issues facing Aboriginal Canada. And he is right. And he is right because no student should have to leave their culture and their identity at the door when they walk into a classroom in order to succeed. Thank you.